Hello, everyone. I'm here today with Michael Robbins. Michael Robbins was the founder of District of Learning and is the co-founder of Learning Pathmakers. He's on a mission as a builder of human digital learning systems. So, Michael, hello, and
Hello,
thanks for
thanks for
joining
having me.
us. I'd
Absolutely.
love to hear about your journey, how you began with this work and how it's evolved into what Learning Pathmakers is today.
Sure. So I've been working at the intersection of education, technology, and community building for 3 decades. A lot of that has been at the grassroots level, in some of our most marginalized communities, working with teens and families involved in the juvenile system. I worked on the startup of AmeriCorps and have been, engaged as a public sector leader and social entrepreneur, in many ways. Um, the work I'm doing now, I think links most closely to the 5 years I spent as a senior leader in the Obama administration, where I led work for the U.S. Department of Education and the White House on community partnerships in education. A big piece of this was looking at at the role of technology, not just for learning, because we were seeing that happen, but looking at how technology can really be a tool for collaboration, how we can have stronger partnerships between teachers and parents, between schools and community-based organizations, and then digging even deeper at this role of data, at a time when we had, one-to-one rollouts of devices and these big data systems being created. It was a train wreck. And so I worked with our Office of Education Technology and others. And, what I found was this work that the MacArthur Foundation had started doing. They'd piloted what was the Chicago Summer of Learning, where they were using digital badges to credential learning that happened all the time and anywhere. And I saw this as an opportunity. And so when I left the department, this is a little over 5 years ago, I launched District of Learning here in Washington, D.C., and worked with the MacArthur Foundation and others to build a mobile-first platform for digital badges, learning playlists, and online portfolios. But as we know that, even the best technology doesn't work unless you have the human side of it. And, the real challenge was, how do we build the people side of the learning ecosystem, the partnerships, the understanding, the different approaches. And so, we've been working on this now for over 5 years, essentially, like, how do you make remote learning work? And so when the pandemic set in, we started engaging with our partners and others, particularly around questions of equity, because this transition to Zoom school was a real equity killer. We lost 3 million students. We didn't know where they were. Now, schools made amazing pivots overnight, and it's been an incredible feat. But we started looking at what could we do both to respond to this crisis, and then what's available now with the next generation of technology to take this work to the next level. It's really, as we talk about, recovering from the crisis of the pandemic and this term learning loss, which I think we all share some questions about. I think, there is a general conversation about relationships and well-being needing to be fundamental building blocks to address that. But I think it also gives us a chance to go even deeper, which is really looking at issues of student talents and helping them understand what they bring. The same for other people in our educational systems, what families bring, what parents bring, what teachers bring to this. And it's different. And so, as part of the work we've been doing with our Learning Pathmakers expeditions, it's, our first step is activate your learning superpowers. So how do we really start with understanding, who we are, and then building the confidence and you know, agency and ultimately, you know, self-efficacy and civic efficacy that we need, that's been so lacking.
You almost sound like you just described our program.
That's fantastic. I heard that in your in the way that you described it. I'm interested, you know, and I went to visit a school in Southern Virginia. Are you familiar with Springhouse?
Mm-mm.
Springhouse started by this woman, Jenny, who I've gotten to know. Is fantastic, and you know they are also taking this similar approach. It's a small school, I think grades 7 through 12 or 6 through 12, in rural Southern Virginia, and they talk about this issue of vitality is their core thing, right? How do
Mhm.
we actually start with who we are as people, how we're connected to each other, how we're connected to communities, how we're connected to, you know, whatever our concept of, you know, the divine is, and build from there.
Interesting. Yeah, I'd be interested to connect and learn more about what they're doing. And it's unfortunate they're not here because people keep asking me where our kids go to middle school. I'm like, well, there's a lot of different options. There's nothing that aligns directly with what we're doing.
You know, that seems to be the question no matter where you are, is where do our kids go to middle school, right? I mean, it's just this time when we really suffer from a lack of options, and we've seen that reflected in, you know, our historic switch to, you know, is it middle school, is it junior high, you know, this sort of center period, this time of coming of age and transition, and what it really is a transition to autonomy in a big way, right? And we're not good at that. We're not good at it because we haven't built it into our approaches to school, right? It's
No, and we've taken it out of our approaches to society. We've turned into helicopter parents who don't let our kids go to the park by themselves. You know, even myself, I've got a 7 and a 9-year-old, and I worry about sending my kids to the park by themselves, not because I'm worried about my kids being at the park by themselves, but I'm worried about another parent seeing my kids at the park by themselves and, you know, calling in CPS or calling in the police or calling in someone else and be like, there are kids at the park by themselves. Like, well, that's how
I
we learn autonomy. Like, you got to go to the park by yourself.
Yeah, I lived in the neighborhood where the national controversy over the free range parrot here in Montgomery County happened, and that,
Mm-hmm.
you know, we saw that there was, you know, police came and wanted to know what these kids were doing walking alone, and Child Protective Services got involved. You know, it's, and you know, we see this in, you know, I think on our best days, personalized learning becomes, you know, most versions of this is we all get together with our design thinking hats on and our wraparound services, and we say, what is it we need to do to personalize this experience to get this student to meet the goals that we set for them, right? It's it Wait, what are we missing here? So asking this fundamentally different question, which is, you know, starting with what you're good at, you know, what do you want to learn to live the life that you want? Um, we have a group of ambassadors. The Learning Pathmakers comes from the work I've done with District of Learning, which we can talk about. We have the group of our District of Learning teen ambassadors, and a few weeks ago we were on a Zoom conference with them, and I said, you know, when's the last time, uh, you know, someone in school asked you what you were good at? And they just kind of looked at me, and I said, well, okay, how about this? Um, how about, when was the last time somebody asked you what you wanted to learn or how you wanted to learn it? And one of them says to me, Mr. Mike, that's not even funny, right? Don't stop, really. I mean, it just doesn't happen. And you know, with our
Mm-hmm.
over-engineered solutions, with our accountability structures and, curriculum, they're um, they're not just houses of cards. They're also, castles on sand. Um, and we see this chronic powerlessness in society, right? It's in our digital public square where we're pulled apart, where we have, a whole generation of truly, you know, disempowered people for so many reasons. Um, and as a result, you know, the response becomes, in order to feel powerful, a response that prioritizes posting over protest and protest over problem solving. And they're just, and oftentimes when I engage with people on social platforms, and because my work has been in problem solving, in social entrepreneurship, government, nonprofit sector, business sector for 3 decades. When I say, okay, let's talk about how we actually can solve this problem, um, first I tend to get, like, people are like, what are you talking about? What do you mean? And then I get, oh, I couldn't do that. Like, I'm just going to stick in with my corner of the world. And when I've pushed people, they've actually gotten angry with me, right? That this isn't a thing. We can't problem solve. And it goes back to our fundamental approach to education. And so we officially launched, me and my co-founder, Cecily Darden Adams, we launched Learning Pathmakers earlier this year, to do sort of two things. One is to respond to people now in the context of the education crisis that they're dealing with. But then secondly, understanding that there's such this chasm between what's technologically possible and the tech future we'll be experiencing in the near future, and that we need a way to bridge those things. So we've been working on that, and happy to dig into the different pieces of this as we talk more.
Yeah, so you talked, one of the things we've talked a lot about as we looked at launching a distance learning program and everybody moved to Zoom school is that idea that tech doesn't really work without humans. And how do you still teach empathy, and how do you teach connection, and how do you keep classrooms and keep teachers together and build that relationship when, I mean, it's great to see you, but the reality is I'm looking at a flat glass screen.
Right.
And so how do you create that connection with people using technology?
Yeah, it's and there are ways to do that. There are even ways to do that with Zoom. But what we launched into was uh, trying to replicate in-person classroom instruction, right? Instead of using Zoom as a relationship building tool. And now, as a result, we have even more work to do. Like, you look at schools coming back, and every middle school or high school is facing a situation where half the students are new to the building coming in this
Mhm.
fall, right? They probably don't know each other. And relationships, school culture can be so fragile, and take such a long time to build. And unless we focus on this fundamental relationship building, we're going to be feeling the impacts. I mean, we will already, but we'll be even feeling them worse, the impacts of our education crisis for a decade.
Yeah, as these young people grow up and still are struggling with Zoom school and with building that relationship,
Right.
and with that not necessarily loss of learning as much, but loss of connection that we've had.
Yeah, connection
Yeah.
to each other, and connection to their communities.
Hmm. So
So, in all this work, we've been consulting and collaborating with dozens of education leaders across the globe, and really digging deep on technology, and specifically looking at 4 different areas for technology. One is data, which is just really important. The second is blockchain related. The third is artificial intelligence. And the fourth is this area, the best general term is spatial computing, but it's what encompasses augmented and virtual reality and the spatial web. These technologies are not just technologies for learning. They in fact will define the way that we interact in school and work and life in the not too distant future. But we know that we can't just start with technology. We have to start with the human side of things. So Cecily and I, in February, we launched the inaugural pilot of the Learning Pathmakers expedition. And we structured a 3-week interactive experience that started not with this idea of systems reform. This is a time when everyone's talking about reimagining education. We've been doing that forever. We've been involved in that. We see it happening in small pieces, and your school is a great example of that. But the system as a whole, what we see is it's already trying to go back to a normal that doesn't actually exist anymore. That's what systems do. And so with the Learning Pathmakers expedition, we're focused, not to the exclusion of systems, but we're focused on the perspective of students, the most powerless group of people in this equation of our learning ecosystems. And we're focused on what each of us can do as individuals. So with the expedition, we brought together over the course of 3 weeks, about 150 teachers, education leaders, parents, students, technology experts, and said, okay, how can we chart a different pathway, right? So these visions exist. What we bring to this that is really fundamentally different is, what does that pathway look like to get to that different future?
What does that pathway look like?
I'm glad you
set up that
asked.
question perfectly.
Yeah. So we have 7 steps that we've mapped through, and we led people through. We're in the process now of taking this and turning it into an adaptable solution, a set of resources that school communities can use with their own work going forward. The first step is activate your learning superpowers. And it gets to this issue of student confidence, of agency, of self-determination. For each of these 7 steps, we also had a value that we anchored off of. And our value for this is self-determination. My co-founder, Cecily Darden Adams, is a Clifton strengths coach and has deep work in talent development. And so really starting with, no matter where you come from the learning ecosystem, if you're a student, teacher, parent, community partner, what are your talents? How do you build on those? And recognizing that we all have these that can bring us together. Our anchor for bringing people together is what we call our learning DNA. And it recognizes the fact that each of us do 3 things. We are all learners, we're all educators, and we all support the learning of others. And at a time when society is being pulled apart, how can the fact that we all engage in these things bring us together? So it's bigger than just schools. It's about stitching back together our social fabric at a time when we're being pulled apart. So we focused our first step, activate your learning superpowers, around what is it you bring to this learning DNA, to this learning genome that we can build. We have it, bits and pieces of this in education. We have it in other fields, right? We have healthcare case managers, we have social service case managers. But this is a role that parents serve. Cecily has come to this work from the Flamboyant Foundation, that's been doing really deep work from the teacher side on parent-teacher engagement. But the fact is, we have a lot of work that we can do from the parent side and from the student side on building those relationships. So, what does this role of learning navigator look like? And we talked about that and how you would work with them. Our value for that section is opportunity. Our third step is extending this learning navigator, and we call it build your social learning network. It's, recognizing that learning is a team sport. Our approaches to education don't recognize that, right? They grade people on individual achievements. They're isolating. And so here it's really, how can you, and here again, taking it from the student perspective, how can you build your learning team? Who are the people that you want on your learning team? What is it that they can do? So in building this learning team, our value for this piece around activate your social learning network is the value of love. It's, how we come together and want for each other what we want for ourselves. You'll notice that in all of this, I really haven't talked about technology yet. But as we go through this, as we've gone through the expedition, in each step, we've talked about like what could be the supporting role of technology. We know that the best pathway forward is one of co-creation, of engaging people in designing and understanding and building the tech solutions that will support their work and learning. And where we really start to get to the tech is in our fourth step, which is owning your learning data. Education is the place where we collect the most information on people, the earliest in their lives. They don't know most of it exists. They don't have access to it. They couldn't understand it in a lot of cases if they did. And in many cases, it's not data that would help them. For us, owning your learning data is about owning your information to be able to tell your story, to write your story for success, for school and work and life. And at a time when data ownership is a much broader issue in society, we look at, movies like The Social Dilemma. We talk about this issue of data dignity and how, fundamental ownership of data is something that's essential. As part of this, we've been working with technology experts on designing an independent accounting system for learning data. With District of Learning, we were using digital badges and a platform for that, but we can do so much more now with data science, with blockchain technology, with private and secure data storage, emerging technologies that literally weren't available 5 years ago that allow us now to you can own your learning data just like you own Bitcoin, right? Or Dogecoin. Imagine what's possible if you could do that. So, for our value for data, there is one of transparency, and transparency is also linked to trust, and we have all of these opaque systems, both on social platforms, in big data, e-commerce, education, and it's time that people be able to see what the data is about them and to own it and secure it in better ways. Moving into our fifth day, we started looking at what we've been doing with District of Learning, which is how do we build a connected learning ecosystem. What does it look like to connect learning everywhere? Our value there was solidarity, recognizing that schools can't and shouldn't go it alone. I mean, teachers are worn out, right? Leaving the profession in droves. People are not wanting to become educators because of this. One of the failings of this no excuses movement, and is that in their quest to own responsibility for learning in the classroom, regardless of what the student is experiencing in the community, the schools have put blinders on, and they've relegated community partners to field trips and after school programs and wraparound services. But the truth is that these communities, our communities, are full of learning resources. What we need is better ways to connect and credential and coordinate them where they happen all the time and everywhere. And so here, we're also working on how we use, technology. I could go much deeper on this, but looking in particular around this idea of a Pokemon Go for learning. Um, and so it's something that we've been anchoring our work, bringing together our technology collaborators and our education collaborators, and focusing specifically on developing this in Washington, D.C., but also, as a model for others. Um, Pokemon was, there are, imaginary monsters all over. How do you catch them all?
Is. I've gotten sucked into
Is.
Pokemon Go. My son every day is, can we see what Pokemon are here? Is there a Pokestop? Is there a battleground? What Pokemon are in the battleground? Mom, what's your favorite? You like Abra?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Now imagine
It's
you're
still
walking
very
down this.
alive.
Imagine you're walking down the street, and it's you see a window, or you walk by a building and something pops up, and it turns out that it's a learning opportunity or a person in there that because of what you have done in your game, or because of information and preferences you put in, it's something that you'll be interested in, right? Particularly too for our most marginalized young people. Even public spaces are inaccessible in their minds, right? And so here our value is really one of solidarity. It's this: how do we connect everything? How do we use this augmented reality enhanced experience to there's learning opportunities everywhere. How do you catch them all? Our seventh step, our value here is justice, and it's really the action of making this happen. How can we each become learning path makers and take this work forward? Along the way, I have also a deep history in mediation and conflict resolution. The design of the expedition builds on that, recognizing that we're not just in crisis, we are in conflict. And that if we are going to collaborate and create better solutions, we have to come together in ways that we haven't come together before. And so, as we move to this step, and there's other things embedded in these other steps as we go forward, but we move this step, it's really like, what are the doables? What can we do together differently? And this is where it starts to cross over into the systems change, because we know that in our conversations in the pilot expedition, what happened was, we had people that were across institutions who would say, oh, we might be able to do this together differently. And then people inside individual school communities who said, oh, we can put this to work in our community. Our last piece, is really, I'd say peace. Our value was also peace. Our last step in the expedition is to celebrate learning. Our conversations around education are just always so dreary sometimes. And this is we designed the expedition to be fun, right? We have to bring, and at a time when we're, this isn't to be Pollyannish about all the difficulties that we're facing in the middle of the pandemic, but we all need fun, right? And learning can be fun if we do it the right way. If we don't treat responses to learning loss like this image of, force feeding farm animals comes to mind, right? It was a gavage, the practice of force feeding geese through a tube for foie gras, right? Like, that's what I think about when I hear learning loss. Like, we have to start with, building your power, like building your personal strength is fun. It's rewarding. Building relationships, connecting with your community. So there are these steps. We are, as I mentioned, working on, what I, in shorthand, called a Pokemon Go for learning, but it ends up being a lot more. It's really, how do we then move to the creation of a connected learning ecoverse that's grounded in technology, built on a set of core values, isn't owned by some mega corporation, right? We have these big social platforms that have dominated ownership in our public square. Um, if I look back in history, and I do quite a bit because I'm also studying public theology along with all of this as well, we look back to feudalism and the models of authority that existed then. Feudalism, slavery, society. I mean, there are real strong analogs between some of these big platforms, the way our digital lives are structured and what we experience there. Um, and it stems from some technology problems that are actually being solved right now. It's really interesting. One of them is just this issue of digital identity, right? Self-sovereign identity. It hasn't existed on the internet for 3 decades. We're not people. We're session cookies and logins, which is of course why Google is very excited to get rid of session cookies because they have the logins. But people saw quickly beyond that. There's technology, one of our collaborators is, and actually several people are working on basically how do you establish yourself as a secure, independent entity on the internet. This is coming very soon. So this issue of identity. Secondly, this issue of ownership of data. And so we've been, talking with people in data science around this. Sir Tim Berners-Lee, the founder of the World Wide Web, has launched this company called Inrupt to take this issue on, using solid technology where we can secure our data locally. And then, this is where things start to get more technical, and Cecily's always like, Michael, you need to dial the tech stuff down, but the tech capabilities are amazing. What we can do with edge computing and distributed applications and blockchain, and the emergence of the new spatial web, which will literally redefine the architecture of the internet. But I'll stop and say again that we're in an education crisis. And we can't start with any of that, right? That's way too big. Even just talking about the data privacy apocalypse, which is real, is way too big. It's like global climate change. People can't get their heads around it, right? What we need to start with is where people are now, what's important to them, how we co-create a pathway forward. They have to understand this, and the best way they can understand it, and the just way they should understand it, is to be part of co-creating this future of learning and work and life.
Yeah, to go back to something you said a little while ago, we are in crisis and conflict, and we need to be creative and collaborate to figure our way out of this. And I can clearly tell you're super excited about a lot of the really great technologies that are coming out. In all honesty, I'm a little with your co-founder. You're running a little over my technological knowledge of the world. But I do see a lot of opportunity. And as you're talking about owning your data, it makes me think about things that we do now with building student portfolios and creating a personal brand. And so much of I think a piece of what struggles with relationship building is that so much of what's online is what we decide to share with people. It's not who we are. It's a slim, one slim sliver of our full humanity is what we share online. And some people share more than others, and some people share their vulnerabilities, and some people only share their strengths. But that's all we see. And there's so much more to humanity than that. And so
how do you use this word? It's like, how do we see each other? Right?
Mm-hmm.
We have to see each other. We have to understand each other. And if we use technology in a different way, it can help us with that.
Yeah, and I'm excited to see what comes next with the AR and VR revolution. And I hear you talking about, the Pokemon Go of education. And for someone who's interested in history, like I think it'd be fascinating to walk through my hometown and see people pop up that were a part of the town 100, 200, 300 years ago and tell me about like what life was like then or what stood in this spot, before
Yeah.
this skyscraper was here.
That technology is here, right? The future is here. It's just not widely distributed, right? That William
Hmm.
Gibson would say. And and so for us, part of this is how do we get to the point where we actually engage young people in creating what that kind of experience you just described, so that instead of where they are now, where our internet treats us as spectators, consumers, and participants, that this next generation becomes really the entrepreneurs and the owners of this work. Um, just to talk here for a second about this tech gap. You're there in San Mateo. I've been there and worked with schools, education people. I've worked with tech companies, and I know that all you would need to do is where you are, walk out and probably look around and see these buildings, right? And to the gap with what's happening in those buildings and what we're dealing with in education just gets widening
Wider and
exponentially,
wider. Hmm.
wider and wider, right? And we have to bridge, along with charting this new pathway to achieve a different vision for education. We also have to chart a pathway to cross that chasm to bring people along. And that involves pulling people from both directions. Our approaches to school also, they silo knowledge, and in the process, they also result in, I think, people that are, tend to be highly specialized and segregated from each other in our work world. We fight for the rest of our lives to bridge those gaps. And so, how do we bring people together, from all sides of this equation, so that that gap doesn't exist? This is going to be a tumultuous time. By 2030, augmented reality wearables will replace the phones in our pocket. That is a future that we are not ready for in so many ways. You think about Pokemon Go, right? And the stories about people walking out into traffic playing Pokemon Go, we're gonna look back at that and say, isn't that quaint? Like, life was so simple then.
You
We
just made
have,
me think about Google Glass and
right,
how what a cool idea it was and how far ahead of its time and how it just didn't work at that moment. But
right. But also issues of privacy,
mhm.
right? How it fundamentally changes human interaction. Um, our new social platforms, will, the frontier on this is really, community connected networks, with augmented reality devices. Like, how do we start now understanding that's where we're going to be in 10 years? So with Learning Pathmakers, we're really excited to be able to both, we told this to someone, we were explaining our work to someone, who leads innovation work, for Teach for America. You may know him, Mike Yates.
Mhm.
And Mike said, like a lot of people are talking about this stuff, but what you're doing is, like, you're creating solutions for 2030 and for now. So we're hoping to engage people in this journey with us. We have to build this together, and in the next few weeks, we're going to be sharing more information about how these Learning Pathmakers expeditions can are something that people can dig into on different levels, as individuals, as education organizations, or as school communities, and really think about first starting with with students, and then starting with building relationships, bringing together school leaders, teachers, parents, students, and community partners. We need all of that to make this work.
So how can people get in touch with you if they want to learn more and they want to be involved?
Absolutely. There's a place to sign up for our mailing list on our website, learningpathmakers.org. We are also very active on LinkedIn, which my teen son calls Facebook, but for even older people. He's not wrong.
He's not wrong.
He's not wrong. And so I'm there on LinkedIn. Welcome people to connect with me there. Michael Robbins. I also post on LinkedIn with three hashtags in particular. One is Learning Pathmakers. The second is Data Dignity. Talking about data ownership and ethical artificial intelligence. And then the third is Into Spatia. There's a lot behind that term, but that's where I talk about our future interactions in virtual reality and augmented reality environments.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time. I think our next conversation is going to be closing that chasm between technology and education. And I think that's where, that term reinventing education and so much of that is focused right now is nobody really knows how to do that, but everybody knows we got to do something.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd love to dig into that another time, but I want to be cognizant of time and say thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a real pleasure. As you can tell, I could talk about this for hours. I hope that it went in the right direction, and I hope that we have opportunities to collaborate on this going forward.
Yeah, of course. Keep in touch. I'd love to hear more about what you're doing, be involved any way that we can. And this is great.
Oh, outstanding. Thanks so much.
Thank you.